All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us again today for the second session of our LGBTQ Preparedness Training. And we have with us today again Ariel Bustamante. And Ariel will be presenting this training that's hosted by the Center for Housing Solutions, our COC collaborative applicant. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Ariel for today's session.
Thanks so much, Sasha, and good morning, everybody. Good to see some returning faces and whatnot and names. So good morning to everybody. And this morning we are going to just pick up where we left off yesterday. So we are going to build upon the knowledge that we gained yesterday, some of the skills we gained yesterday, and put all of that into practice today. At the end of our session, if we are shorter on time, we can absolutely collect any particular questions, comments, etc. that you have and get back to you individually with responses. Same thing goes if you have any questions around case consultation or just any other needs that may come up for you. So the first thing that we are going to do this morning is we are actually going to do another one of our Kahoots. So we're going to do that this morning. We're going to start off with that, and then we are going to go into some content. The Kahoot we're going to do today is going to take us from the information that we got yesterday and build upon that. So in just a second, you're going to see that pop up on your screen. You're going to go to kahoot.it from either your browser or from your cell phone. If you have a smartphone, I recommend doing that. That's a lot easier than having to figure out browser windows. So you should be seeing that popping up on your screen right now. Again, kahoot.it, and that passcode for this session is going to be 6269143. While we wait for folks to join us, you're going to get to see a video about our Models of Pride conference.
There's other people like me, and I can be myself, and I can wear whatever I want and feel however I want and empower myself.
I would have to say the people. The people are amazing here.
It is just exciting to be here. I remember the first time I came to this conference years ago, and I'm happy to see you all here. So excited to help build communities like that, to help change the world.
I'm really excited about the trans relationships workshop. Dating is hard enough, and then being trans on top of it makes it a lot harder.
It provides a safe place for everyone in the LGBT community. And it informs too a lot, even for the allies. You learn
We have about half folks there. I'll give y'all another minute or two to join that.
Others, like just helping them through like anything that's just really makes my day. It's just helping them. Coming next year would be awesome.
Being at this conference is literally better than Disneyland for me.
It's a great resources for so many youth, and I'm one of them. I'm someone who definitely benefited from all the people who dedicated their time to the center to come here and really give us the opportunities that we so desperately need.
I have a son, he's 17, he's transgender, and he came out a couple years ago, and 2 years ago was my first Models of Pride, and so I came as a parent, he came here as a participant. I just learned so much. My son is now fully himself.
Having a program like this when I was 14 years old and trying to figure out how to come out to my parents who are very super religious, and I grew up in the Bible Belt of Texas, something like this would have been very helpful for me.
I grew up as a little girly boy in Oklahoma, and it means so much to me to be able to come and offer those kinds of resources and information and advice to these youth, because I would have loved to have had this when I was little.
For me, just seeing all of these faces and the diversity amongst them is such a beautiful thing. It's indicative of what the future is going to look like, which is awesome.
Models of Pride is helping people really find their voice and realize that it's okay, and helping them learn how to deal with this next beautiful chapter of their life.
Even though the world is a much more accepting place, if your world is not accepting, coming out is just as hard today as it was 20 years ago. While that is still in existence, there's going to be a need for Models of Pride.
Models of Pride!
Alrighty, so we'll get started. And again, we have about half of folks there, but we'll go ahead and jump into that. And if you weren't able to join for whatever reason, you can respond in the chat. So let's get started with this. This is going to be on the last 2 units we covered yesterday. Alrighty, so what are some ways to support conflicted staff of LGBTQ plus clients? Is that Red Triangle, provide education to dispel myths and stereotypes. Yellow Circle, recommend spaces to encourage expression of feelings. Blue Diamond, tell them they shouldn't feel conflicted. And or Green Square, remind them that their behaviors can impact the client's health and well-being. Yeah, so all but number 2, when it comes to working with staff, family members, community, right, friends, we don't want to invalidate where folks are at. We want to be able to build connections with them. And so telling somebody that they shouldn't feel the way they feel is something that isn't going to be too effective in order to gain their support or their interest in learning more. So we want to be able to provide education and whatnot. Again, that reminder, but we don't necessarily want to tell them how they should or shouldn't feel. So starting off, we have Melodic Buffalo, Clever Shark, Groovy Impala, Agent Gator, and Caring Raven in our top 5. And this is another multi-select. So a client's housing program that only allows a partner of a different gender than their own may be experiencing what kind of bias? Is that Red Triangle, anti-gay bias, Yellow Circle, affirmation, Blue Diamond, validation, or Green Square, heterosexism? And you can select as many that you think apply. Yeah, so the 2 that we're looking for here are anti-gay bias and heterosexism because it's based on the client's sexual orientation and their relationship status. So not a lot of movement on our top 5 right now, but good job, Stellar Lion, up 3 places. Our next question is a true or false. Is it true or false that rejecting behaviors can lead to things like depression, suicide, and other high-risk behaviors? Blue Diamond for true, Red Triangle for false. That is true, yeah. And one of the great sources for that you might be interested in learning about is called the Family Acceptance Project, and they've done some really great research around the effects of rejection and affirmation as well. So a little bit of movement there. Agent Gator, Caring Raven jumping up, Shiny Dolphin on an answer streak. And another multi-select this morning, accepting and affirming behaviors can lead to which healthier outcomes for LGBTQ plus people? What do we think? Is that Red Triangle, higher self-esteem, Yellow Circle, closer relationships with family, Blue Diamond, better overall health, and or Green Square, high levels of depression? Yeah, so everything but depression. Depression is definitely not a healthier outcome for anyone, but those affirming and accepting behaviors that we demonstrate, that natural supports demonstrate, absolutely can lead to some of these healthier outcomes. So a bunch of you getting answer streaks, love to see that. We have another true or false. So is it true or false that heterosexism is the societal belief and assumption that everyone is or should be heterosexual? Is that definition true or false? Red Triangle for false, Blue Diamond for true. And that is true. So we reviewed those definitions yesterday of anti-gay bias, anti-transgender bias, and heterosexism. Good job, Dandy Frog. You're getting 5 in a row. Y'all are on fire this morning. Folks came ready. All right, so which questions can help us to assess for a client's safety and well-being in their coming out process? Red Triangle, what is the youth/client experiencing in their coming out process? Yellow Circle, have they tried being less outwardly LGBTQ+? Blue Diamond, where do they need support? And or Green Square, do they feel safe? Yeah, so asking somebody if they've tried to be less of themselves is definitely not something that's going to help us assess for safety and well-being, again, in any setting. So good job on that. Y'all, this top 5, whoever's in the top 5, I mean, everybody clearly is doing well today, but the top 5, not a lot of movement there this morning. Bunch of you getting, again, answer streaks. So multi-select, again, anti-transgender bias can impact those who what? Red triangle, identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. Blue circle, or sorry, yellow circle, are assumed to be transgender or gender nonconforming. Blue diamond, associate with transgender or gender nonconforming. Green square, only those who have transitioned legally and medically. Yeah, so we looked at this one yesterday, similar to anti-gay bias, but it's those 3 there, right? If you are transgender, you are perceived to be transgender, or you are associated with trans people. So our second to last question is another true or false. Is it true or false that clients can experience their own internal struggle with heterosexism as well as anti-gay and anti-transgender bias? Red triangle for false, blue diamond for true. And that is true. Love that we got 100% on that one. And let's go to our last question of the morning, another multi-select. We can work to unlearn anti-gay bias, anti-transgender bias, and heterosexism by doing what? Red triangle, doing self-awareness checks. Yellow circle, asking youth to be our main and only source of LGBTQ+ best practices and youth/clients. Blue diamond, seeking out support and education, and or green square, practicing supportive behaviors. Yeah, so again, we don't want to rely on the client ever to be sort of the educator for different things that they're experiencing. They absolutely are the keepers of their own experience, but having to train us or educate us on, identity is something that we don't want to have to put onto the client. So let's look how things went. Let's see, we have Clever Shark in 3rd place. We have in 2nd place Caring Raven, and in 1st place, I want to say that was something, but yep, Melodic Buffalo. And our runners-up were Agent Gator and Great Crane. So give yourselves a round of applause. Fun way to start off the morning. Again, you're welcome to gloat in the chat if you feel so inclined. And yes, Allison, yeah, we had Todrick Hall perform a couple years ago. We usually have some type of known entity performing and participating in Models of Pride just because it's a big fun event and a lot of folks want to take part in that. So let's see in the chat, anybody else? No, nobody wants to claim leadership this time or the leaderboard. All right. So like I said this morning, we are going to build upon the knowledge that we had from yesterday. And we're going to start with talking about full spectrum thinking. So moving on from sort of unit 2 and 3, we're going to start to talk about some key principles around SOGI to better be able to do this work. So we're going to go over 5 principles of SOGI. And then from there, I'm going to actually break you out into multiple breakout rooms where you're going to be paired up with 3 or 4 folks, and you'll have the opportunity to actually apply these different SOGI principles to a scenario. So the first principle of SOGI that I want to review today is that these things are all distinct and separate, right? Sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, those are all distinct from another. And if it helps you, I encourage you to keep thinking about those different spectrums, right? Because they were each their own spectrum. They never touched one another, and they don't necessarily inform one another. The second one is that SOGI all exists on spectrums, right? So we know that these identities are not necessarily fixed in time. We know that language varies by individuals. And we want to be able to reflect their individual experience and not assume that there is any cookie cutter way to be part of the LGBTQ plus community or any particular SOGI. The next one that we have here is that SOGI is intersectional. So what we mean by that is that sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression absolutely intersect with other identities that our clients have. So that includes everything like race, class, ability status, right? All of the different unique life experiences that they have had, all of the different identities that they carry, and all of the ways that those things can coexist. So we'll look at some different statistics later on today. But when we start to look at intersections of things like SOGI and race, for example, we start to see different pictures emerge. And SOGI is universal. So all of us have a SOGI, and it's a natural part of our development. So yesterday morning, we talked about sort of that childhood development, those milestones, gender identity developing around 2.5 to 6 years old, sexual orientation around 6 to 12 years old. And that's something that all of us have gone through. And again, that's one of the reasons why we frame this around SOGI rather than solely fixating on LGBTQ plus identity. And last but certainly not least, SOGI is self-defined. So how somebody understands and articulates and shares their SOGI is self-determined, right? So we, again, want to be able to honor where folks are at and understand that each person is going to have a different experience. So I'm going to put those in the chat box for you all because, like I said, we are going to be doing an activity in just a bit, and I want you to have those 5 SOGI principles handy. Any questions before I jump into the activity that we're going to do? All right, so we're going to get to working here. So in this next activity that we're going to do, you're going to have about 6 to 8 minutes in your groups. And each of you are going to be given a different scenario. It's going to be intentionally vague, but pretty short. And as you look at that statement or scenario, I want you to first start by identifying which of the SOGI principles or principle do you think mainly relate to that statement. And then I also want you as a group to think about a response to that statement using those SOGI principles. So I want you to then apply those SOGI principles to come up with, as a professional, what would I say in response to this comment that I might be hearing? Does that make sense to folks? Saw a couple of nods. Awesome. And then when we go into those breakout rooms, if you need support, you can just hit that ask for help button. And then Sasha or myself will pop in there if you're having technical difficulties or if you are forgetting what the prompt was. So our first group, and I'll put this in the chat, group 1, this is going to be your scenario. Group 1 is going to be looking at this statement here on the left-hand side. A professional says, I think my client might be gay. He's been wearing nail polish and asking for skirts. So that's group 1. Then we're going to go on to our second group. Group 2 is, there's all these terms, genderqueer, non-binary, agender, gender fluid. What's the difference between all these terms? And I'm realizing I'm going to give you all the answers if I click through these. So I'm going to go back to that. I'll read out the scenarios, but I'm going to put them in the chat for you. So group 2, again, is so there's all these terms. What's the difference? Group 3, I'm going to put it in the chat as well. I think I might be non-binary, but I find myself feeling aligned with my assigned gender some days. Does that mean I cannot be non-binary? Group 4, why are you asking about my pronouns? Can't you tell? So that's group 5 scenario, or sorry, group 4. Group 5, your scenario here, a professional says, are we sure we want to talk to him about healthy relationships? You know he has autism, right? Group 6, yours is in the chat. If he wants people to believe he's a transgender man, he needs to dress in a more masculine way. My group 7, she says she's bisexual, but I've only seen her be with guys. And this is coming from a natural support like a friend or a family member. Group 8, do I really have to ask an 8-year-old client if they like boys or girls? Isn't that inappropriate? Group 9, you're going to be answering this one. I'm not gay, so I don't need to learn about gender identity stuff. And our last group, group 10, from a professional, my caseload is mostly clients of color who deal with issues of racism in the system, not homophobia. I guess I just feel overwhelmed learning about all this stuff that isn't really relevant to the clients I work with. So again, I'm going to put you in those groups now. And once you get into those groups, you'll have, again, about 6 or so minutes to be able to come up with a response to that, while also identifying which of those SOGI principles apply. Before I do that, does anybody have any questions for me? All righty, so I'm going to put you in those groups now. And again, if you have any questions, you can hit that Ask for Help button, but I'll put you in those rooms now to start working with your coworkers. Alrighty, welcome back everybody from your first breakout room of the day. Hopefully that was a fun and interesting activity for you to be able to do. And now we're going to go through those. So let's start with our group number 1. Let's see, group number 1 was Angela, Diana, Kimberly, and Lauren, I believe. So we had this scenario. I think my client might be gay. He's been wearing nail polish and asking for skirts. My first question for you all is, which of these did you apply to it?
Okay, I'll speak for the group. I think that the one that most applied was probably number 1.
Separate? Okay.
Because we didn't have enough information to determine anything from 2, 3, 4, and 5, because it was such a vague assumption about what he was expressing for himself, or you know, as in what the professional gave us.
Okay, so let's see what we got here. So we're looking here at number 1. Yes, so good job, group 1 on number 1, distinct and separate. We're also looking at self-defined, so knowing that somebody could be gay and wearing nail polish or asking for skirts, right? There's not one cookie cutter way to be gay. So we would also say self-defined would fit here. And then, Angela, did your team come up with a response to this particular statement if you heard it from a colleague?
We thought that in this instance that the client was actually exploring himself, the way that he wanted to express himself. And so it was something that the professional still needed to continue to explore with him to help him to understand himself better, to give him a better way of wanting to express himself, or wanting to tell others how he identifies.
I love that. Yeah. So we want to encourage our colleague, if a colleague came to us with this kind of statement, to say, right, like, we're here to support the client. We're here to meet the client where they're at. We're here to apply all those different principles of things like, you know, harm reduction and trauma-informed care and all of those things. And so part of those things include potentially sitting with some of our own questions or discomfort independently and supporting the client in their process. So I love that y'all focused on that. All right, so let's go to our second group. Who was our speaker for group 2? The question or the scenario here. So there's all these terms: genderqueer, non-binary, agender, gender fluid. What's the difference between all of these terms?
I guess I can talk.
Thanks so much,
okay, so I think it's probably all of them, honestly, but maybe not.
Okay.
And is the professional saying this to a client?
In this scenario, I would say they're saying it to you as a colleague.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but that certainly could make for a different scenario, right? As far as the response.
Because I would say definitely Google it if it was to a client, because they should not have to educate you if it was a client.
Yeah. So how would we respond if this was to one of us?
Do you want me to educate people? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like if your group came up with a response, how would you respond if a colleague said this to you?
So I'd probably just explain it that like genderqueer is like kind of a blanket term, and non-binary to me just means in between or on, just gender diverse, not specifically male or female. Agender would be not having a gender. Gender fluid would mean moving back and forth between any of the genders. And that's how I would respond, but I don't know anybody else.
That's great. Yeah. So just if we have that knowledge available, doing that education with them, maybe sharing some reputable resources and things like that. And one of the things that you're going to get at the end of this training via email is I'm also going to send you all a link to a vetted YouTube playlist. So there's lots of helpful information on the internet. There's also a lot of not helpful information on the internet. So we've done the work of being able to kind of screen some videos ahead of time that we think will be helpful for your ongoing education, but also things that you can share with colleagues, with clients, with natural supports, you name it. So the ones we're looking at here, we're mainly focusing on numbers 2 and 5 here. We have that SOGI exists on spectrums, right? So understanding that many of these terms, right, don't necessarily describe a fixed place, and also that these things are self-defined. So while we can provide sort of a shared definition to this information, we also, at the end of the day, want to be able to rely on the client on how they self-define. So if a client shares that with us and we aren't sure, we can say, thanks so much for sharing that with me. Can you tell me a little bit more about what it means to be agender for you, right? And in that way, we're not saying educate me on all of these terms, but we're saying I want to understand your experience as an agender person. So group 3, a client says to you, I think I might be non-binary, but I find myself feeling aligned with my assigned gender some days. Does that mean I can't be non-binary? Who is our speaker from group 3?
I can go.
Thanks so much, Samantha.
So we talked about how that was going to be exist on a spectrum, universal, self-defined. It was kind of hard when we were like talking about how we would answer this question too. A lot of us pulled in kind of like all of these to answer. We wouldn't go down a list and like answer them like, well, actually this. Like our answer kind of encapsulated a lot of these, a lot of this framework. And then also trying to answer it to, you know, like this can develop over time and it's not, you know, it, like, yeah, it exists on a spectrum and that sort of thing. But then also we thought like, oh, is this person like seeking validation too in their identity? And so not wanting to like not wanting to be dismissive about it in like, this can, you know, exist on a spectrum and grow over time, but also like kind of figure out exactly what they're trying to ask too, like, like, are they seeking an identity or are they just wanting to know, like, is this normal, that sort of thing?
Yeah, this is something I think, right, a lot of folks may be going through is thinking, well, there's got to be a cookie cutter way to be whatever term it may be. So I think one of the big ones here is definitely self-defined and again exists on spectrums here. So there's non-binary people who do feel aligned with their assigned gender some days. There's non-binary people who feel very much distanced from that assigned gender, and they can still be non-binary. So definitely 2 and 5 for this one. Let's go to our third group. Why are you asking about my pronouns? Can't you tell? So who was our speaker for that group? I think that was group 4, actually, not group 3, because we just did group 3. Was that Allison, Beth, Chelsea, and Kim, or was that Christina, Jessica, and Tia?
We are group 5. We're group 5, yeah.
Okay.
I can hear me. Chelsea. Oh, go ahead, Allison. Sorry. Well, if you can hear me, because I know I was having some microphone issues.
We can hear you, Allison.
Okay, cool. So, we were saying the number 1 and what was it? Number 5, I believe. We were talking about. We just thought that a lot of these questions could be under a lot of them. And I mean, what we really talked about was how sometimes asking people their clients is difficult because they might be pretty biased to this group and not understand. So it's kind of our job to educate our clients about how it's really important to be open to other people's diversities. And Chelsea made a really good point about saying we need to be diverse and open to everyone's different ways of life. And this is how us as an agency are being open to the LGBT or the SOGI of a person, and how that in itself can actually show a client that if we're open to this, then we can also be open for them to even just come in and tell us about their drug addictions. If they like thinking, well, if you're open to SOGI, then maybe you'll be open to the possibility.
Thank you so much, Allison. I think I got the main gist of that. Your mic was having a little bit of issues towards the end there, but yeah, so for this one, right, we're looking at 4 and 5. So knowing that SOGI is universal, it doesn't matter who you are, right? We all have a SOGI. And also understanding, for example, that pronouns are not something that we can tell based on looking at somebody. Pronouns are something that all of us use and something that we want to kind of normalize. Again, self-defined. And I love that framework as far as a response to say, listen, we as an agency, we serve lots of different people. You're going to be interacting with lots of different people. So this might be a learning opportunity to make sure that our shelter, our program, whatever that may be, is a safe space for all clients that we are serving here. All right, so group 5, a professional says to you, are we sure we want to talk to him about healthy relationships? You know he has autism, right? So who was our speaker for group 5?
I don't think we.
There we go.
Go ahead.
All of us probably could be, but go ahead.
Well, I think you have more information.
I can say that there's two of us in the group that have I have an adult child who's on the spectrum, and then also there's Jessica. I can't remember the other what's her name? I can't remember. Is she in with us?
Yeah, I think so.
I don't know, but she also has a teenager that is, and so I know that we dealt with, my daughter's also gay, and so we've dealt with discrimination, systematic discrimination since, I mean, just for a long time, especially when she was a teenager, and the police didn't think that she had remorse, and they didn't realize she just doesn't show, certain emotions. And so I felt like this was really good that we got this one. And I feel like it's more on a number 3, intersectional. And then I kind of also feel like I can touch on 4, the universal. And then how we would respond to that. Just say, hey, everyone is a person. Everyone deserves to, and I've had this happen, like she works with people, my daughter, with disabilities. And so a lot of times people discriminate and say, oh, because they have disabilities, they don't have relationships, they're not capable. And so it's just a matter of educating anyone who has that bias. And that's what I do if I get a question like that.
Yeah, thank you, Tia. That was excellent. And it sounds like this scenario was perfect for a lot of folks. So I'm glad that we had it in here. And I also thank you and others for kind of sharing those disclosures, because, again, that's part of normalizing, is being able to talk about different identities. So yeah, we're looking at 3 and 4 here. Great job, right? So again, everybody has a SOGI. We know that it's universal. Whether you're on the spectrum or not, whether you have any other type of disability, if you're neurotypical or if you're not neurotypical, right? We all have a SOGI. The other thing is that it absolutely intersects with things like ability status. So we want to make sure that we're having these conversations with clients, right? Again, that's part of that bigger permanency picture. And if that's something that a client is bringing to us, or a conversation that hasn't ever happened with that client, that is a really important piece that we, or maybe an appropriate colleague, can play, right? But we also know that there's lots of intersections as well for folks experiencing homelessness with other sort of negative experiences, like intimate partner violence. So we should absolutely be empowered to have those conversations with clients, regardless of their background. All right, so our group 6, a client tells you if he wants people to believe he's a transgender man, he needs to dress in a more masculine way.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, April.
Okay, awesome. So originally we said self-defined, mainly because how someone self-defines themselves is pretty much all that matters. It doesn't matter their outward appearance or how they carry themselves. And then after we started talking, I think exist on a spectrum could work as well, only because we were talking about what one term means to one person may not mean the exact same thing to the next person. But if that's how they're self-identifying themselves, then that's, once again, really as far as that conversation needs to go. And then as far as like a response, we're basically just saying, a person's sexual orientation isn't determined by their outward appearance. And then B, you never know someone's personal circumstances of why they carry themselves a certain way. So if someone identifies as a trans man but doesn't dress quote unquote masculine, the one doesn't have anything to do with the other. We kind of brought it to our, like I said, as a heterosexual woman or a cisgender woman, that doesn't mean I have to wear a certain type of attire, because once again, one thing doesn't have anything to do with the other. So just not labeling somebody a certain way based off their physical appearance.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the nuance that you got into that. And yeah, so first we're looking right at this idea that gender identity and gender expression are somehow inherently intertwined. And as we know, those things are distinct and separate. As you mentioned as well, it's self-defined. So you could absolutely have a transgender man who says, my gender expression, I would like it to be more androgynous. But the other kind of nuance that I heard you speaking to in particular for the clients that we're speaking about, right? There's a million reasons why a client who's experiencing homelessness may not be able to align their gender expression in the way that they would like to, right? Access to resources immediately coming to mind. safety coming to mind, right? So lots of reasons why a client may or may not have their gender expression align in the ways that we expect them to. And our next group, I think that's group 7, a natural support says to you, she says she's bisexual, but I've only seen her be with guys.
Yeah, so I can touch base on this. So when we were looking at this, we looked at exist on a spectrum and self-defined. The dialogue that we would try to have is maybe just exploring with the person making this comment, maybe just some self check-in, if they have views that are just really black and white on those spectrums, or or sort of how they view that. And also just that it's not up to us to define someone else's sexuality.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Short, sweet, to the point. And yeah, we're looking at exist on spectrum. So knowing that the way folks identify and the way that they experience that identity can be very different. And then of course, self-defined. So that one was short and sweet. Our next group, group 8, a professional says to you, do I really have to ask an 8-year-old client if they like boys or girls? Isn't that inappropriate?
Yeah, so we broke it down. We sort of like categorized how that works. So we had self-defined and universal, intersexual, and exist, and then distinct, separate, sort of at the bottom, like how we were looking at this. And our conversation, I mean, well, one, obviously sort of depending on what services are provided, because, for some of us, like what their relationship or what they view isn't important. But at the same time, we talked about how we all have that grandmother who's like, so who are they dating today? So that those conversations can come up. And even though professionally those conversations may not come up, those conversations come up every day in life. So that's kind of how we looked at, like where they fell on it. So.
Yeah, we absolutely are constantly, especially with younger kids, talking about relationships, whether or not we realize it, right? We're constantly making sort of cutesy remarks and things like that. So, there's that piece, right? Normalizing that piece. And we're also here, right? We're not saying, and again, it's depending on the services. If you're working with younger children, if you're working in maybe child welfare, different fields, right? This is an 8-year-old, right? There might be a reason why we're having that conversation in order to be able to provide culturally responsive services. But we're not asking this child about any particular behaviors, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about who gives you butterflies, right? So that might be relevant. And the biggest one I would say here is universal. So normalizing that everybody goes through a process of developing SOGI, regardless of who they are. We all go through the process of developing our sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So our next group, a client says to you, I'm not gay, so I don't need to learn about gender identity stuff. So maybe this comes up, you're doing intake, you're going through some questions, and they're like, why are you asking me some of these things? Let's see, who was I think that's our group 9, I want to say, or was that group 8? I think that's group 9. That was Jacqueline, Keisha, and Olivia. Did we have a speaker from group 9?
I'm the speaker, but I believe we answered the wrong question.
Oh, well, no worries then. Let's go through this as a group. So I'm not gay, so I don't need to learn about gender identity stuff. The ones we would group up with this one is one that SOGI, again, distinct and separate. So you have a gender identity. Just because you're not somebody who is transgender, non-binary, agender, two-spirit, doesn't mean you don't have a gender identity. So it's universal as well, right? So understanding that in this particular scenario, the client is conflating being gay, which is a sexual orientation, with gender identity. So that's an opportunity to let them know, hey, again, at our agency, we want to provide you with the best services. One of the ways we do that is having a conversation about these different things. And reminding them, if there's ever a question that you don't feel comfortable answering right now, that's okay too, right? We can always come back to that at a different time if it's bringing up a particular tension for you.
Miss Ariel, was that the last question?
No, there's one more.
Okay.
There's one more. So our last one here.
Oh, may I interrupt then? Let me go back, because then again, we did answer that question, but I believe it was a little bit different. And then so the wording was a little different at the end. So what we did say was 1 and it was 5. It was self-defined because the individual kind of defined himself. But when looking at the spectrum, it would also go and exist as a spectrum because of the language that he used. That's what I'm throwing the exist on spectrum in, but it was 1 and 5. And far as the agency is concerned, we would not even speak on it. We would just address the immediate needs of the client at that time, and then develop a report. And if something came up, then we would address it.
Great. Yeah. So again, I think we can find a way to merge sort of, you know, that educational piece with them, but also again saying, listen, we want you to feel safe. We want all of our other clients to feel safe. We also aren't going to force a conversation on you if that's something that is activating for you. All right, in our last group, a professional says to you, my caseload is mostly clients of color who deal with issues of racism in the system, not homophobia. I guess I just feel overwhelmed learning about all this stuff that isn't relevant to the clients I work with. And who was our speaker from our last group?
I can go.
Thank you, Katie.
Hi, we said that it's intersectional and universal. Like you said yesterday, you know, it's gradient because of the layered human experiences, and it's beneficial to learn that everybody has a part, and everybody's unique, and it's best to learn as much as possible.
Great, thank you, Katie. I would say the other piece of this too is understanding that our clients might simultaneously be experiencing things like racism and homophobia at the same time, right? So if we aren't able to acknowledge those intersections that our clients are facing, we're going to miss an opportunity to support them. We don't want to have to segment their identities in order to be able to provide them the best care possible. So some key takeaways from this particular sort of set of SOGI principles is 1, we cannot assume a client's sex assigned at birth, gender identity, sexual orientation, or sexual behavior based on their gender expression. It's a common myth that because we can see sort of the package somebody arrives in, that we have all the information about those things, and we don't. Again, we talked about that. There's lots of reasons why a client may be showing up for services and, you know, not be able to represent those things. But gender expression, again, not an indicator of any of those things. The next thing that we want to remember here is that we want to work to understand the variety of terms that can be used in different communities. I can tell you right now, we're never going to know all the terms. I myself, as an expert in the field, somebody who gives legal testimony as a subject matter expert, will not ever know all the possible terms out there. And that's okay. So normalizing that there are different terms, being open to learning those terms, and knowing that there's different terms in different communities. And we also know that we serve clients best when our services take into account all of the different identities that our clients hold as they intersect with their SOGI. We also want to remember that all clients have a SOGI. So when we are centering the needs of clients who experience different forms of bias, that is going to move us closer to equity, right? When we center the highest needs clients, whether those are queer and transgender clients, clients of color, you name it, right? Those are ways that we are going to actually move the needle for all of our clients. And last but not least, in order to understand the language clients use to describe their SOGI, we can build rapport with them and learn more. So going back to some of those sort of core skills. So our best practice guideline here actually comes from Brene Brown. Love her stuff. And when it comes to sort of understanding folks, we want to remember that empathy is not connecting to the experience. Empathy is connecting to the emotion that underpins the experience, right? So empathy isn't about us always having to or being able to put ourselves in other people's shoes, but rather understanding what is underlying there. So with that in mind, it's about 8:08 in my time zone. It is 10:08 where y'all are at. So we are going to take a quick break. Let's come back at 10:15. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do a little like 7-minute break. Yeah, we'll come back at 10:15 and I'll see you shortly. All right, so we're going to jump back in now, and we're going to talk about supporting and affirming towards permanency. The first thing that I want to dig into this morning in this unit is I want to talk a little bit more about some of the key populations we are focusing on. So in Unit 1, we had a lot of statistics around LGBTQ plus young people. I know most of you or many of you in today's space serve either adult populations or elderly populations or veterans, so different sort of demographics that we also want to touch on. The first thing I want to look at here is the idea that we know that there still are many institutional obstacles when it comes to shelter spaces and other service providers that are providing services to our clients, even if they're not necessarily homeless services providers, right? So one of the things we look at, for example, is when we look at young people who are experiencing homelessness, we know that there is a difference between runaway and homeless youth shelters versus domestic violence shelters, right? And there's limitations on that that can create technical difficulties in providing care for young people who may be leaving a violent situation with a partner. We also know that typically a minor isn't going to be able to access services at something like a DV shelter. And vice versa, oftentimes runaway and homeless youth shelters are not equipped to deal with intimate partner violence. So that alone, right, is something we see. We also see, just generally speaking, within DV shelters, that when it comes to LGBTQ plus people, again, providers aren't equipped to deal with those relationships, the dynamics of those relationships, and oftentimes folks are misidentified as the abuser in the relationship. In general, shelter safety measures are typically not designed for transgender and intersex people, right? The way that we have logistically set up our systems, the policies we have in place are typically not there. And even though it's 2021, there still absolutely remains a stigma around HIV/AIDS status and other STIs. So be it if we are a medical provider or if we are a case manager that has knowledge of this, whatever our particular role is, there still can remain a stigma around that and in providing care to those folks. We also know that a lot of folks have been refused treatment altogether. So a lot of folks will show up at a shelter or show up at a program to access, core or critical services and be turned away. A lot of folks have reported, so about 1 in 5 transgender people have reported being refused treatment at some point in their life. And almost 30% of transgender people specifically report experiencing some type of discrimination in a healthcare setting, which again is one of those spaces we would hope that all folks are able to access. But that again is assuming that folks can access those to begin with. As a couple of you have pointed out, right? We're talking about a large geographic area. So we're talking about places where folks may not have access to transportation. And so getting to maybe a larger area that has better resources may not be applicable to all people. And then the last piece here is that the screening processes oftentimes don't take into account people's SOGI. So specifically within LGBT veterans, it's estimated that there are about 1 million lesbian, gay, and bisexual veterans nationwide. Specifically within the number of transgender veterans, we're looking at anywhere from 134,000 to 163,000, generally speaking. The caveat I give to any data, no matter who or what we're talking about, right, is that when we're talking about people's identities, we have to inherently assume that these numbers are going to be lower than the actual number is, because a lot of folks aren't going to feel safe to be able to disclose this. One of the reasons specifically for LGBT veterans is the existence of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So that policy, even though it no longer exists, right, is something that has been incredibly pervasive. And so naturally, service members, either active or veterans, may not feel inclined to disclose this information for fear of how that will impact their standing in the military. So this one is a little bit tougher to gauge. But we do know that within the LGBT veteran population, we know that transgender veterans experience homelessness at 3 times a higher rate than for non-transgender veterans. We also know that about a quarter of those same veterans, so transgender veterans, fear experiencing some type of mistreatment at a shelter environment. And among veterans, we also know that the rate of transgender veterans using, VHA type programs, it's about 37, over 35%, between 35 and 40% greater than for non-transgender veterans. So we do have, again, some data around this, but it's one of those populations that we are sorely lacking in a lot of data. And then generally speaking, as well, as we look at other populations, when we look at transgender and gender nonconforming adults, so transgender, again, we're talking about somebody's relationship between their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity. Gender nonconforming has to do with gender expression, so somebody who falls outside of the norms of how we expect them to present themselves. We can see here from the National Alliance to End Homelessness that when it comes to folks being unsheltered, we see those numbers jump up drastically. And the same thing here as we look at these statistics as well. Unfortunately, those numbers have actually been increasing. We would hope that those numbers are decreasing, but over the past several years, those numbers have absolutely decreased. And this sort of juxtaposes the kind of teal or aqua color. It represents sheltered folks, contrasted with unsheltered folks, that darker color there. So let's talk about how we can actually make spaces that are affirming and safe of LGBTQ plus clients. My question for you in the chat here is, what qualities about a place make you feel safe? When you think about the safest, comfiest, best place that you could be right now, what is it about that place that makes you feel safe and welcome? So Alice says the other people there. Yeah. April says friendly people. Yeah. So it's about who is or isn't there. Are those people friendly? Maybe they're familiar people. Jack says representation. Yeah. So again, seeing yourself reflected in the space that you're in. Christina, non-judgmental. Samantha, the warmth of the place, the decor. Yeah. Is it a cozy place, or is it like a really sterile, bland, uninviting space? Amanda says the environment. Diana says being around individuals like myself, friendly, right? So being able to connect with folks. Allison, so spaces that are understanding. Janice, acceptance. We have smiles, welcoming from Kim, right? So, when you walk into a place, does somebody say, hi, welcome, how are you doing today? Or are you left kind of figuring things out for your own? There's a reason why so many stores have greeters and other folks when you walk in to sort of make you feel like, you are part of that community. Jacqueline says the surrounding and the people. Kimberly says the energy. If the people are warm and friendly versus cold and harsh. Yeah. Also, we have here music, others' energy being peaceful. And Tia says a place that is clean, warm energy. Yeah, these are great. These are great sort of descriptors here for spaces. So it's interesting too, because when we think about safety, when we think about welcoming environments, right, our brain probably doesn't automatically go to, let's say, the DMV, or waiting in that long line at the post office, or sitting in our car for an hour while we're waiting to pick up our kid after school, right? Those are not places our brain goes. We go typically to familiar places, calming places. Maybe it's our home, or a specific place in our home, like that one spot on the couch, or our comfy bed that has all the pillows that we want. Maybe it's a vacation spot that we got to go to and we feel safe and serene there. But there's so many qualities that are intrinsic that make a place feel safe. So we're going to talk about some of those ways that we can support that. Some of the things that we can do, and we started to hit on this a little bit yesterday, is through environmental cues. So what are the images and things that we have represented in spaces in order to be able to let people know that they are seen, that they are represented, and that they are cared for? And what you'll see here, for example, at the top left, this is sort of an adapted version of the LGBT pride flag. In recent years, out of some great work in Philadelphia, that black and brown stripes, those two have been added to this color scheme specifically to call out and name and represent that there are black and brown folks in the LGBTQ plus community, and that those intersections are important to see. In the center here, we have the transgender pride flag, and on the top right, we have the intersex pride flag. But you don't have to put up a literal pride flag in order to let folks know that you are safe and affirming. Some of the things that you may see in your spaces or have seen in other spaces, for example, are sort of adaptations. So taking these colors, taking this framework, and putting it onto a poster, a sticker, a pin, you name it. So on the bottom left, this is actually our program's Brave Space poster that we have. It was designed specifically by clients experiencing homelessness, who shared with us what they would like to see walking into a space to know that that shelter or that provider is safe and welcoming and affirming. And similarly, different organizations have developed their own different imagery. So a poster is absolutely a way that you could go about doing this. But you could also, again, look at something like having a pronoun pin, which is something that I have on my lanyard at all times. No matter what meeting space I go to, I introduce myself with pronouns. I go to a lot of different spaces like government meetings and whatnot, always introduce myself with pronouns. And I carry, see if I can get this in there, a pronoun pin on my name badge. The other thing that I have on my badge, this is from our Out for Safe Schools program, which is kind of like RISE, but a school-based program. They distribute these really cool, let's see if we can get it in the, there we go. Nope. Might have to turn off my virtual background. They distribute these awesome cards here, as you can see here. And these go on teachers' lanyards, right? Teachers are always on the move when school is in session. So they have these on their lanyards to let students know that they're an ally, that they're supportive. And on the back, there's actually a list of really quick resources and tips for them. So if the teacher is ever struggling, they have access to that information. So again, lots of different ways that we can be thinking about, and something for you all to be thinking about at your agency level, but also at your continuum of care level. How are you communicating to clients what your space is and isn't about? So with that in mind, let's talk about then, and we got a little bit of practice with this morning with our principals. How do we address these different moments that may come up where the safety of a space is compromised? We're going to look at two different types of scenarios, right? We might have a scenario where there's an appropriate comment or question, and we might have a scenario where there is an inappropriate comment or question. In any event, we are going to be able to kind of use a communication cycle to be able to intervene or educate during these moments. So let's say you put up a rainbow poster in your agency's lobby area. A client comes in, the client says, "Whoa, why do you have this gay poster up?" We would say that that is an appropriate comment or question, right? It's not especially inflammatory, and it's definitely a moment for education. In this type of scenario, the first thing that we would do is we would validate the good. So we want to be able to connect with that person. Again, this is going to draw on probably a lot of those rapport building skills you already have. So you might say to that client, "Thanks for noticing our new poster here. It clearly caught your eye." And then we want to be able to clarify. So is the client saying gay as in bad, as in stupid, as in uncool? Or are they saying gay as in LGBT, right? We want to better understand that. What is their understanding of that word as well? From there, we can educate and inform them and let them know, as an agency, we want to make sure that everybody who walks through this door knows that they are safe and welcome here. We have an obligation to provide services that are inclusive to everyone. And so one of the ways that we do that is by putting a poster up. And then we can also encourage the client or encourage the person in this scenario and say, if you have other questions or concerns about this, I'd love to kind of keep the door open for you to be able to come to me with any questions that come up for you. So a pretty simple communication cycle. Again, I'm going to put this in the chat. First thing that we would do is validate. Second thing we would do is clarify. Third thing we would do is educate and inform. And the fourth thing we would do is encourage. So in just a second, I'm going to actually put you into breakout rooms again. And this time, you're going to be paired up with only one other person. I have one group of 3 because we have an odd number today. So that group, you can get creative as to how you do the scenario. It'll make sense in a sec. We're going to do a little bit of a role play here. Jerry, a client, asks you, "Do I have to share a room with a gay person?" So maybe they're being referred out to a housing program where they're going to have a roommate, and Jerry comes to you with this concern. Now, we don't have any other information about Jerry or the roommate. We don't even know Jerry's pronouns. So keep all of those things in mind. But when you go into your breakout rooms, you're going to have about 5 minutes. One of you is going to take on the role of the client. One of you is going to take on the role of the professional. Again, for my group of 3, our odd person out can decide if they want to be Jerry's friend or if they want to be another professional support. So you're going to have a chance to look at this scenario, and then I want you to utilize that communication cycle to be able to process this question with Jerry. So I'll put you in those groups now. Again, you'll have about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to debrief this question in a few slides. Alrighty, welcome back, everybody. And again, we're going to have a chance to debrief this scenario, but I want to give you sort of a slight variation on this scenario before we debrief this one. So we just looked at an opportunity to educate, right? A client comes with you to an appropriate comment or question, right? Let's look at what happens when we have an inappropriate comment or question. What do we do when something really just kind of crosses a line? And I'm seeing folks already saying it was difficult, they felt challenged by this. Hopefully it didn't feel impossible, but I do want y'all to feel, again, challenged, pushed by it, and to sit with some of that particular tension. And we'll have a chance, again, to debrief and talk about what worked well and what didn't. So let's say that we are dealing with an inappropriate comment or insult. Let's say that a colleague comes to you and says, you know, I just don't get all this stuff. It's too complicated. I don't even know why I need to know about pronouns. This just isn't something that I'm really gonna think about or take on. The first thing that we want to do in a situation where there's an inappropriate comment or insult is we want to intervene. It is critical, especially if a comment or question or inappropriate behavior happens in any sort of setting where others are present or could overhear, that we intervene not just for that individual's sake, but also for everyone else. There is absolutely a bystander effect that happens when a client, a staff member, etc., something inappropriate happens and somebody doesn't hold somebody accountable for that. Now, we're not talking about publicly shaming anybody or anything like that, right? But we are saying that when these moments come up, folks need to understand that there is going to be some type of way that in a professional way, that comment, that insult, that behavior is addressed. So we want to be able to intervene. Maybe we say, you know, hey, that's a really uncomfortable thing to hear from you because we serve so many different clients. Can I talk to you a little bit about that, maybe in a more private space? And then we want to be able to name the bias or name the hurt. So a lot of people aren't going to resonate with the language of saying, hey, you know, that sounds like anti-transgender bias that you're exhibiting, right? And even when we say things like homophobia or transphobia in place of those biases, that might be language that alienates folks. So oftentimes naming the hurt can be a really effective way of talking about the impact of that, right? So we're really just trying to couch it in what is the impact of that statement. And in this case, we might say to our coworker, you know, we serve so many people, and I know it may not seem like this is especially important, but I've seen the effect that it can have on clients. It makes a difference. And it's something that a part of our standards of services we're expected to do. And when we don't do those things, when we don't do things like ask clients for their pronouns or affirm their identity that they share with us, that may mean that they're less likely to come back for services from us and may continue to experience the cycle of homelessness and poverty, right? So kind of coming back to our goals as professionals, right? Why are we there? What are we doing? And how does that affect the other person? And then we can educate and inform them, you know, so we can kind of probe a little bit into that. You know, is it that you're confused? Is it that you need more information? I'd be happy to practice with you around pronouns if that's something that's coming up for you. Or is it that you're struggling to understand, you know, how this affects our clients, right? Depending on that, we can do more education. And then last but not least, we want to ask for tangible change. This is really critical. And again, I'm sure many of you, whether you work in any type of behavioral health background or if any of you have kids, it's important that we keep things clear for folks, right? So if we say something like to a client or coworker, you know, maybe you should try being a little nicer. Nicer is such a subjective term, right? I need you to do better. Again, very subjective. So we want to ask somebody for something tangible here. So if I'm this person's supervisor or superior or in any way, I might ask them or suggest to them and say, I would really like you, first of all, to refrain from making those types of comments. That's not acceptable here. And I'd really like you to try on and start practicing asking clients for their pronouns. I think that the more you do it, the more comfortable it's going to become. But if you choose not to do it, you're never going to be able to get comfortable doing that as a part of your normal intake process. So again, we want to be specific here. So I'm going to put you back into your groups again. Only this time, I want you to flip. So whoever was Jerry last time gets to be the professional, and whoever was the professional last time gets to be Jerry. And instead of Jerry asking you, do I have to share a room with a gay person? Jerry uses this very derogatory word here. I'm not going to say the word. I don't expect y'all to use the word. If you don't know the word, just know that it is an incredibly derogatory and absolutely unacceptable term to be used, certainly in the shelter or other, homeless services spaces. So I'll put you in those groups, and again, you're going to switch roles and have the opportunity to practice with one another. So give me 1 sec, and then I will put you into those groups. Looks like we had a little bit of movement. All right, so I'm going to open those groups now. Welcome back, everybody. I know that one, I don't know, that one may have been easier, that one may have been tougher. Who's to say? Sometimes those tougher scenarios, we're like, we got this. We're channeling that one client who we know of, who comes to mind, and we got this. Or maybe not. So let's go into our debrief. My first question for you all is, what was it like to play the role of Jerry versus the professional role? And I'm seeing some shout outs in the chat as well. Chelsea giving some props to Keisha. Good job, Chelsea and Keisha. So what was it like to play the role of Jerry versus the professional?
Well, personally, I enjoyed playing Jerry. It was fun. Actually, it was fun because being the professional, you're always on the other side of the road, on the other side. So being able to be the client and to express, saying things that I know that my client has said to me, it was actually fun for me.
Yeah, so maybe even a little bit cathartic, right? We're like, okay, we're tapping in, we're understanding where is our client coming from, what might we be met with, and how would we respond to that? I love that. And I see, again, more shout outs, Samantha, Jacqueline as well. Any other reflections? So Diana says it was hard to play Jerry as it is not in alignment with my values and feelings. Yeah, so again, that might be something that we encounter regularly. Clients are sharing things with us that don't reflect how we sort of operate, and yet we still have to be able to connect with them. I think back to that Brene Brown best practice guideline already, right? Chelsea said, I did not like playing Jerry using the derogatory language. Yeah, so having to utilize harmful language or behaviors can definitely be a challenge. And what do you all think you did well, or what do you think your partners did well? Were there any particular moments where you thought, okay, this is something that I've seen in the past that I think is going to be effective here, or that my partner did that seemed to be helpful? Janice also added, it was harder for me to do the professional role, tended to get emotional regarding the bias. Yeah, so part of that anti-bias work is not only with other folks, but a lot of times can also be for ourselves to kind of prepare ourselves. How am I going to handle a scenario like this so that I am able to kind of keep those things in check and then find a, appropriate outlet to process afterwards. So any thoughts on what folks did well? Kimberly saying the conversation was really good in order to prepare for that to happen. Yeah, again, we want to get you as prepared as much in this space as we possibly can via Zoom to think about these scenarios that can come up.
I think something Jacqueline and I did well was addressing the language first before we addressed where they're gonna stay. And
Yeah.
so just making sure to understand that what that word means and what it can mean, and feel for someone else to hear it. And also if you're in a place that has group agreements, being able to reflect back to those group agreements and talk about respect and what that means without being shamey either, because we were talking about young people too, and sometimes those terms are used as slang, and so trying to educate versus shame that person for that language. And
Yeah.
so are they using it as derogatory? Okay, that's different. Are they using it because they heard it as slang? Well, let's educate them about that too. And so kind of I think we really address that first before getting into anything else.
That's great. Yeah, so we have sort of a two-pronged approach. Jerry, we're going to talk about your housing. It sounds like you have some concerns, but before we do that, that word that you used is really hurtful. And I'm not sure how you typically hear it or use it, but in this particular space, it's not a word that we want to be using. So if I want to have this conversation, but can I ask you to not use that word while we're having this conversation and in this space overall? And then let's talk about your concerns, Jerry, right? We can still talk about your concerns. The key piece about this scenario as well is the roommate, this hypothetical roommate, doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if they're gay or not, right? We don't know if they're gay. We don't know anything about this roommate. Maybe Jerry just doesn't want a roommate. Jerry wants to have one of the few, individual rooms that the program has. There could be a million reasons. So we want to focus on where Jerry is at. We do want to be thinking about the safety of any potential roommate, of course. If Jerry makes any comments if that person tries anything, I'm going to make sure I put them in their place. That's a concern. But beyond that, right, there's more substance to this scenario. So Chelsea mentioned here, Keisha took a pause to center herself before responding. Yeah, so maybe we take a deep breath. Maybe we even say, whoa, Jerry, that was a rough word to hear. I just need to take a second, right? And we can name those things. And then Keisha addressed the hurt and gave a goal for moving forward. Kim mentioned, as the professional, I didn't want to get too authoritative when intervening. Yeah, so I know that word intervening can feel a little tough or prescriptive, right? But it really just means, hey, we're going to pause and we're going to address this moment in a way that feels best to us and for our space and the context there. Jacqueline also says that the role play was a good tool. I love hearing that, Jacqueline. Anything that you might do differently next time. So now that you've had a chance to practice it a couple of times, you've heard from some other folks about how they handled their scenarios, anything that you would do differently if you were to redo this scenario, or if you were to encounter this scenario in real life.
Ariel, I was thinking after listening to you that I would label the hurt that the word meant, rather than talking about we just don't do that or just getting hung up on the rules or the label, just addressing more of how that could hurt someone, the feelings.
Yeah, I love that, Cam. Thank you for that. So we can definitely let Jerry or the client know that that's not an appropriate word to be using. But we also want to be able to back that up instead of just saying, well, the rules are, or we just have this policy, or that's disrespectful. That's going to be more effective in the long term for somebody to be thinking about, how they're showing up in the world. Any other thoughts? So let's see. Tia says, I would want to peel the layers to possibly learn why the bias exists. Yeah, so has this person had a negative experience? Is this a word, especially for young people, maybe they're hearing this word a lot in their space, and for them it's normalized to call people this word without thinking about the implications. We also see in the chat, respond instead of react, take a step back. Yeah, so again, it's not to say that it's going to be easy, but that active listening piece is going to be really key. And Janice also said, encourage the client to express where they are at. Yeah, so I want to hear you out, Jerry. It sounds like you have some concerns. And I want to go through that with you, right? That's part of my job, is to go through that with you. And part of my job is also to make sure that everybody here is safe. So in order to do that, one of the things we need to do is not be using harmful language like that. So let's look at one more scenario as a group. You're in a case planning meeting when a colleague continually misgenders your client, Eli. The colleague has been made aware of Eli's name and pronouns, but continues to use the name and gender marker listed on documents. How would you intervene during the meeting and/or afterwards?
I would ask to speak to my client alone, get away from the group, and remind them who Eli says Eli is.
Mm-hmm.
And to please respect that. And that's just my start.
First of all, Gwen, I want to give you big props. We didn't use any pronouns on this one. I noticed you didn't either, so good job on that one, practicing just using the client's name because we don't have that information. Yeah, so maybe we say, you know, can we take a quick 5-minute break? And then that might be a chance for me to talk to my colleague and have a sidebar and say, hey, you know, Eli uses, you know, they go by Eli, they use these pronouns. I'm noticing that that's not happening in the meeting. And we can explore that with curiosity, with openness, right? Again, intervening doesn't have to mean attacking or being aggressive, but just to say, what's going on and how can I support you in this meeting? Also see in the chat, I would start interrupting with the proper pronoun at each misgender, and maybe they will understand. So every time they say he, we say she. Every time, you know, whatever the pronoun is, right? And just kind of be on it. Any other ideas about what we could do? The only other thing I might add here again is coming back to like, what are our goals? What is our purpose? So, and Kimberly, you're getting right to this. I explained that using the correct pronouns can be empowering for the client, and in their care, it's important to use their correct pronouns. Exactly. So listen, it may not feel important to you to use the client's name and pronouns, but it is absolutely imperative that we are supportive and affirming of them. And this meeting, I feel like, is getting derailed because the client isn't able to engage fully because they keep getting misgendered, right? So that's something that we can, again, bring it back to the client, bring it back to the purpose of the meeting, the space, whatever it is. And you know, if there's any need maybe to address it down the line or outside of the meeting with the colleague again or with somebody else, we can absolutely do that. I would also say we might want to check in with Eli, right? This is a conversation that we would want to just say, hey, I know that might have been a rough meeting. How are you feeling about that? And we can even think about this from a sort of safety planning mentality. So if we have a client who discloses a different name or pronoun to us, one of the things we can also be doing is say, hey, you know, in a situation that may come up where maybe somebody slips up, how would you like me to handle that? Is that a scenario where you feel comfortable intervening? Is that a scenario where you'd like me to intervene? What does that look like and feel like for you? Because you could have folks who say, yeah, thanks for asking. It's exhausting to constantly do that work day in and day out to correct people. So if you could do that in the case planning meeting, I would really appreciate that. Or they may say, you know what, I know that person is trying, they're working on it, but it's a work in progress for them. So it's really okay in that situation. So it may vary by situation. So our takeaways for this particular unit, we want to remember that affirming spaces are inclusive and welcoming environments. Environmental cues can communicate what a space is about and what it's not about. And our best practice guideline is that action should reflect affirming cues to help LGBTQ+ clients feel welcome and safe. So it is just a couple minutes past 11. We're in our home stretch of our training today. We're going to take our last break of the morning. We're just going to take a quick 5-minute break. So if we can be back at 11:09, I'll put that in the chat. And alrighty, so welcome back, folks. And we're going to jump into our last unit of the training now. And Jacqueline, saw your comment there. No worries. I think probably sharing some of the frustrations that many of us experience when we have those moments, and maybe internally, right, we're sort of screaming or shaking our fists, but externally we're cool, calm, and collected, tactful professionals, right? So no worries. So in this last unit, we're going to focus on some of the key laws and policies that are going to be affecting this work. The first thing that we want to look at here is guiding principles for managing information. So when it comes to handling disclosures that clients make about their identity, what is the obligation there? What are the best practices? How do we use or not use that information? We talked about this yesterday, but as a reminder, we want to know that disclosing somebody's SOGI without their permission can be harmful. That, first and foremost, we have to understand. The next thing when it comes to managing information is that gathering information is a continuous process, right? So all of us change over time. We know this. So if we are to expect that somebody's information is going to stay exactly the same over the entire time of services, we might be doing a disservice to them. And then we want to make sure that the information comes directly from the client, not from their previous case manager, not from a family or friend, not from anybody else. We want to hear it from the client to be able to reflect back their language and their experience. So I'm going to put those in the chat for you all, because we are going to watch a video now about Kellen. Kellen is a young man from the New York City area. And as we watch Kellen's story, I want you to pay attention to how his information was handled and what, if any, best practices were followed or were not followed. We'll watch that video and then we will have a chance to debrief, making sure my sound is connected. All right, we should be good to go.
My name is Kellen. I'm 19. I like reading. I like going to art museums in the city and painting or drawing. I had moved out of my parents' house because I was seeing a doctor who confided in him, and then he told my parents under permission, and things were just really tense and there was a lot of yelling. It felt like the right time to leave. It was hard being out of my parents' house because I've lived with them my entire life, and that was the first time that I was on my own. It was also difficult hopping around and sleeping on people's couches, not having a stable place to be in. So I came here through the suggestion of a friend.
We primarily focus on providing housing to young people who have been kicked out of their homes because of homophobia and transphobia. But we have a really broad array of services to really help young people be healed. I mean, to help them be safe, to help them get off the streets, but also to help heal them from the harms of homelessness and rejection. We're living in a time where more and more people feel free and able to express themselves as being LGBT. Unfortunately, as much as the acceptance is growing, there are still many people in every society who tend to be very hostile to LGBT people. When your parents are like that, it is very unsafe to come out of the closet when you're a teenager, when you're still reliant on your parents for economic support. So what we see happening all over the United States and all over the world is that more and more young people are coming out of the closet, and unfortunately, huge numbers of them are being rejected by their families and forced into homelessness.
The LA Forney Center has helped me a lot with housing and employment, and I'm definitely a lot happier now than I was a year ago. I'm in a much better place. Hopefully in the future, I'll have either be in college or graduated already. My number one career goal is to be a curator at a museum in the city, so you have to go to college for that. My relationship with my family now, it gets like worse and better. My mom right now is pretty good, like we text every day. I'm not talking to my dad currently because things are kind of difficult with him. I don't feel like comfortable going back to their home at this point. I want them to know that I'm okay, like as okay as I can be, and that I'm doing well, and this is not like a phase, and I'm happiest in this form than I was before.
Alrighty, so let's talk about Kellen's story. The first question I have for you all was, what was the main factor that disrupted Kellen's permanency?
The doctor disclosing his information without permission.
Yeah, so doctor violates all sorts of things, right? Best practices, maybe a little bit of HIPAA, and shares that information with mom and dad, who, as Janice points out, end up kicking him out based on that information. So in this case, we have, up until this point, a pretty good situation, right? We have a young man who is been living with his family of origin for most of his life, is well adjusted, right? Is thinking about career aspirations and educational attainment. And all of that comes crashing down in a very short amount of time later on in his teen years. So what did you all notice about the way that Kellen tells his story? Any observations about sort of Kellen's demeanor or tone or anything about the way that he shares his story?
He seemed a lot calmer than I think I would have been.
Yeah.
And I think it's because he found that good place.
Exactly. I was going to say there's definitely a sense of somberness, right? So I've lost something, I'm struggling. And at the same time, hope. I get a sense that, yeah, I'm not at home, but I'm also at a place where I'm able to be accepted for who I am. Janice also pointed out he looks down a lot. He's monotone, right? So there's definitely a lot of healing for Kellen to do. I hear sort of some conflict, right? Mom, he's able to talk to regularly. Dad, not so much right now. So he's setting some good boundaries. Kimberly said, I think he sounded kind of like he's sad about what happened, but still has hope. Yeah, so I think a lot of folks in a similar situation, it might be really hard to be hopeful, to be thinking about, well, how am I going to move forward, right? What does this mean for me now? And holding those two pieces at the same time can be really difficult. I'm sure many of our clients feel that way, right? Suddenly I'm able to receive certain services and benefits, and at the same time, I'm still struggling every single day. A couple folks pointing out here, Tia says, I think he sounded like, that sense of separation from parents and not feeling safe, right? Christina, he still reported having future goals for his education and future, which I thought was very hopeful. And that's, again, one of those things, right? When we think about moving clients sort of along their journey, is how do we get them to a place where they are able to actually think about a positive future for themselves, which can be definitely a work in progress. Dan also said that even though he is experiencing homelessness, he found a place where he belongs and feels safe. So
I wanted to add, I wanted to add that he said, I just don't feel comfortable going back to their home. Kids.
Right, so it's not my home, our home, the home. It's mom and dad's home at this point. So there's sort of a separation there mentally about whose space that is or isn't. So when we think back to those principles of SOGI, and again, I'll put those in the chat, which of these principles did they follow? Did they follow any of these principles? Chelsea, resounding no. Yeah, none of these were followed, right? This is a all too common example of all the ways that mishandling a client's sensitive information, private information, not secrets, but right, sensitive information can have really devastating effects. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of those principles or some of the practice pieces. When it comes to how we're doing this, the first thing we want to be thinking about is how are we collecting information, right? Is that on intake forms? Is that in a digital system? Do we have inclusive options? Or does our form just say male, female, things like that? Also, where are we collecting that information? When we're doing an intake with a new client, depending on where we are, if it's outreach or in a shelter space, are we able to do that in a setting that allows for privacy, right? And in order to be able to have that client be, feeling a little bit more comfortable to talk to us and answer questions. The next thing we're looking at is how are we actually then documenting that information again, and what systems, who has access to that information at that point, why do they have access to that? And be thinking about, again, when it comes to different things, is it necessary to record that information? So in some environments that I've worked in, for example, when I'm working with probation officers, law enforcement, etc., typically they have a practice that anything that's happened in the shift before gets passed down in full to the next shift. Well, that can create a conflict. For example, if we have two juveniles who got into a fight in lockup, maybe one of the youth says a derogatory term and is, harassing one of the youth because of their sexual orientation. It's very possible for us to be able to write an incident report, for example, in that situation, that says client A and client B had an altercation and fill in details that are necessary without saying client A was picking on client B because client B is gay, right? We can still talk about behaviors without necessarily disclosing all that information. So those are things to be thinking about, right? Some of you may have, protected information if you're behavioral health folks. So that may be something that you are able to keep confidential just generally. But keep that in mind, right? Because when it comes to things like case notes or other documents, I know, for example, in Los Angeles County, we have a coordinated entry system. And so if I were to put in notes about a client into their profile on that system, theoretically, anybody could look up that client and see those notes. So we have to be mindful of that. But then we also want to think about to whom we're disclosing this information and why. As I mentioned, it's helpful to think about this on a need-to-know basis, but also remembering that the client ultimately has their discretion to be able to say who does or does not have access to that information. And last but not least, how are we institutionalizing our practices? I know that I've worked plenty of places where, maybe you're in one environment and your team does something one way, and you're with another team and they do it a completely different way. Maybe it's the supervisor's decision, maybe it's just the culture you have, right? But we want to make sure that this is a shared practice. So one case manager over here isn't doing one thing, another case manager is doing another thing. Outreach has a completely different protocol. The clinicians have a complete, right? We want to make sure that there's synchronicity there. So the other piece then that we're going to get into here then is what are the specific protections that these clients have beyond sort of managing information? And somebody mentioned this yesterday. One of those is absolutely the Fair Housing Act. So this is something that's federal and that we're looking at. And this has to do with a variety of settings, including housing providers through homeless services and other folks that we may be referring to, right? And under the Fair Housing Act, we know that it is prohibited to discriminate against LGBTQ people, specifically, and this is the language that the Fair Housing Act uses, so I'm reflecting their language here. When it comes to policies and procedures, it's important that we use their language. Real or perceived, so essentially actual or perceived, right? Gender identity, or any other reason that could constitute sex-based discrimination. The next piece around the Fair Housing Act that disproportionately affects this community is HIV/AIDS status. So we also cannot deny housing opportunities to folks because of their HIV or AIDS status. And this actually also falls under ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act as well. So another key piece to be aware of. And under HUD, housing programs or other funding sources, we know that actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, and or marital status are also things that a client cannot be denied services or housing for. And then specifically when we think about our setting, so homeless services providers and the facilities that we operate, we cannot be segregating or isolating transgender clients solely based on their gender identity. So there is not any rationale for us to be saying, well, that client has to be separated from the group. That client has to maybe be put in a room far away from everyone else. Specifically, if we're saying it from the sense that they are at some way a risk to others. Now, if we have accommodations we can provide that client says, you know, I would feel a lot safer if there's a more private room that I can have versus this communal space, and that's something we can accommodate, absolutely, right? We can take into account, just like with any other client, things like safety and well-being. But we cannot be targeting that individual, if that makes sense to folks. The next piece that we're going to talk about is the equal access rule. So again, another federal rule. And this is something through HUD that talks about the equal access that clients or individuals have to programs and shelters, right? So specifically within this, it says that when it comes to things like facilities, usage, benefits, right? Any of these types of services that somebody may be utilizing through us or the continuum of care, we want to make sure that we are providing those things in accordance with that individual's gender identity. And that is regardless of any particular documents being changed legally, any particular medical procedures being done, anything like that. The law says that we have to provide services based on that client's gender identity. So as a part of that, that has a lot of different implications. For example, when we're looking at housing assignments, if we are working with a transgender man, that man has the right to be housed with other men. However, if that client says to us, I am concerned about my safety and well-being in a men's program, they could have the option of being housed in a different program, if that makes sense. So similarly with transgender women, non-binary folks, etc. We're going to defer to the gender identity that they self-identify with. The other piece about that, as it mentions as well, has to do with things like marital status, family status, etc. And this also goes beyond our direct services. It has to do anything with the larger provider community. So it is up to us to make sure that our agency has policies and procedures that really make sure that we are practicing this particular policy in full. The other piece I want to draw back onto specifically are the service standards that your community of or continuum of care has. So if you go to your service standards, and we'll be sure to link that for you all as a reminder, one of the things that you can look at is under section 1.6.4. It's a pretty robust section, and that gets into all of the different protections that transgender clients and gender nonconforming clients have under your continuum of care. So the first thing, again, is just sort of reiterating what the Fair Housing Act and Equal Access rules say, that you can't discriminate based on various protected classes, including gender identity and sexual orientation. The other piece here that it names is that you have to be giving clients a copy or a notice of this non-discrimination policy. So you can have that posted on a wall. You can also give that to them. I personally would defer to actually making sure clients are given that. But if you don't have those resources, posting it and making sure you review it with clients as a part of their intake procedure. And thank you for that. Sasha put that link in there in the chat box so folks can easily find those service standards. The other thing as well is that when it comes to any vendors, providers, third parties that you're using as an agency, they are also subject to that. So even if they are subcontracted through you, they are still held to this same standard. So that is something to be keeping in mind as you're vetting new vendors, as you're working with folks. You want to make sure that they understand their obligation not to discriminate against folks. And when it comes to things like training, that is also something that is named in the service standards, hence one of the reasons why we're doing this today. Staff should be receiving ongoing training around things like inclusion and unconscious bias in order to make sure that folks are understanding of these concepts and able to address them appropriately. And the other thing as well, the last thing I'll touch on for section 1.6.4, just draws back to that managing information piece, which is that transgender clients have the right to be referred to by the name and pronouns they go by. So again, regardless of documentation or anything like that, there may be specific places where we have to legally put that information. So that's a conversation with the client. I need to reflect your legal name and gender marker for this document. This is why. I want you to understand that. I want to support you in any feelings that are coming up around that, and know that, you know, in other settings, we absolutely affirm your right to be called by the name and pronouns that you've shared with us, right? So there might be some times where we can't get around that, but that's still a conversation to let that client be in the know. Before I go on any further, any last questions that we have here? All right, well, I'm sure folks will have questions as we start to wind down. So let's go into our final scenario today. You're working with Adrian, who has been on your caseload for months. When discussing Adrian's progress with your colleague tells you Adrian is non-binary. How would you proceed, and what questions might you ask of your colleague? I'm going to put you into breakout rooms in just a minute here, and you're just going to have a couple of minutes to discuss amongst yourselves how you might deal with this type of scenario. From there, we'll come back as a large group, and then we'll have a chance to debrief this. But again, be thinking through, if you're talking to this colleague using all the different skills and knowledge you've gained thus far, how would you deal with this scenario? So in the chat box or out loud, I'd love to just hear from a few folks how that went, answering that very last scenario of the training. How would you proceed with a colleague who has just outed a client to you?
On the question of the context, is it that they've worked with the colleague and they've disclosed that information to them, and that's just something they thought they should pass along, or they said that out of line, or?
That would definitely be maybe a line of question or how we might proceed, I would say, Katie. So, okay. I mean, again, these are intentionally vague because I love that you thought about that. Was like, wait a minute, you know, is it that you worked with this client and they asked you to tell me? Is it that you've just decided this is water cooler conversation? Why are you telling me this? Is definitely part of that.
We did discuss, you know, we didn't understand the context. So what would we take it as? I said, you know, if it is out of line for the coworker, go back to inappropriate comment and let them, you know, talk to them about encouraging to educate themselves on why that was out of line. Or at that point forward, just knowing that information, what can you do moving forward? And that's get yourself familiar and research what's available for them to best meet their needs.
Yeah. So again, maybe it's this colleague is telling you because they feel like it's really important for their care. That still, though, is a conversation to say, you know, did Adrian ask you or give you permission to share this with me? You know, it sounds like this is important information that you think I should have. And I know that we are supposed to be keeping this information private. So I just want to make sure that we're respecting Adrian's right to confidentiality, right? So that can be tough if somebody says, well, it's really important for you to understand that Adrian hasn't been successful in previous programs because of some discrimination they've received. And I want to make sure that they're successful as I transition this case onto you, right? And how do we hold confidentiality and preparedness at the same time? And absolutely, eject questions, it can be very beneficial to the client's treatment depending on context, right? So we shouldn't treatment in the sense of how we treat the client, it shouldn't affect how we treat the client. However, it could have an impact on the types of programs, services, care that they receive. And it sounded like somebody wanted to share a little bit more.
I was just going to say, we didn't quite get the idea that it was disclosing. It was more so, is this something that the client actually told you, or is this an assumption you're making?
Yeah.
Because before we proceed further, we need to know if this was specifically provided to you directly from the client, or, you know, once again, like, is it just like an outer appearance or something they've said that's decided to make you feel this way?
Right. So as a colleague saying like, hey, April, I know you're working with the client, Adrian. Did you know that they're gay? Right? That's a very different context than, you know, April, I know you're working with Adrian now. I know they've been in and out of our program for the past couple of months. And, you know, they've let me know that this is something that's especially important for them as a part of their case management. Chelsea also said, I want to explore why a client may disclose that information to another coworker and not to us, right? So what is it about the coworker that has allowed them to be able to create that space? And also not personalizing, well, oh my gosh, I'm like the biggest ally ever. Why don't they trust me with this information? But instead, okay, how can I move on from this? How can I make sure that clients feel safe? There could be a lot of different reasons why the client felt comfortable sharing that with a coworker and not you. So we certainly wouldn't want to say, well, Adrian, you know, I'm cool with this. You can tell me, right? We wouldn't do that. So, and as you said, Chelsea, it's a chance to check in with our own biases and how we present ourselves to the client. Absolutely. Jacqueline also said, I would need to ask the colleague had he worked with Adrian and thought it was something helpful for me to know and why he divulged it. Yeah, y'all are right on the money. So great job with that last scenario there. All right, so let's look at our units, it should say 6 takeaways there. We want to remember that info about a client's SOGI is private and sensitive. Again, not a secret, but private, sensitive, right? Information that we want to hold with high regard. We also want to remember that safety, well-being, and permanency are the foundations of managing information. So when in doubt, we want to be able to ask ourselves, is disclosing this information in any way going to compromise one or more of those things? And the last thing we want to remember is that clients are entitled to services that do not re-victimize them due to a lack of inclusion. So no matter what we are doing, clients have an inherent right to receive quality services that do not discriminate against them. So our best practice guideline here is that service providers can promote a sense of agency amongst clients by finding opportunities, not only advocating for them, but with them, alongside them. So we're going to kind of go into wrap-up mode now. We can open it up for any particular questions or comments that folks have. And the other thing that I invite folks to answer in the chat here, we can go through some of the responses, is now that you have gone through this entire training, and you can give yourselves a round of applause for getting through all 6 hours of that, how are you thinking you're going to rise up for LGBTQ plus clients in your care? What maybe is a particular learning moment you had in our 6 hours together, and or something that you're thinking you might do differently or try on after this training? So feel free to throw some ideas in the chat box. Excellent. I see a bunch of folks jumping in. Christina says, I want our paperwork to be different in asking gender identity. Great. So updating some documents. April, want to take a more direct role at understanding and acknowledging people's pronouns. Gwen, there's so much info, but really learned pronouns. I did not know this before. Adam is going to share this information with others. Kimberly, I live in a small town in Oklahoma, so I think it's important for me to bring this conversation up to my coworkers. Amanda, not just to be open to conversations when they come up, but encourage conversations. I love that. So let's move from being passive to active. Jack saying, I want to ask my boss about creating a safe place for trans and gender nonconforming individuals in our community, since we are the only shelter that is not religious. Yeah, so again, identifying what sort of strengths, what opportunities do you have? Angela says, I want to continue to check in with myself and understanding my role with supporting the client. And Kimberly says, not that they aren't accepting, it's just a lot of beneficial information. Yeah, so our agencies may be at a lot of different places, but again, everybody can benefit from increasing their knowledge around this topic. So the last piece I have for you here, and I'm going to put this in the chat box as well, is that we have a post survey for you to complete. That link is in the chat box as well for you. And I'll continue to read folks' responses as we go through that. You're welcome to either, if you know how to scan the QR code with your phone, you can scan that QR code, or you can just go to that link in your browser on your device. It's a short evaluation just to let us know how we do. So it's completely anonymous. Any feedback you have there is anonymous, and that information will be shared with me and my team. It will also be shared with Away Home for Tulsa, just so that they have access to information about how this training went. Other than that, I will be hanging around for the next 10 or so minutes in case folks have any technical issues with the evaluation, and or if folks have individual questions they would like to ask. I'm going to turn it over to Sasha in just a second, but I want to thank you all so much for your time the past 2 days. You have been a wonderful training group, and I am so appreciative of all of you attending this training and just being so open to participating with me. So thank you all. Please complete that evaluation. Stay tuned for an email from me with resources and anything else you need. Again, in a few minutes, I'll put up my contact information one last time, but you'll get an email from me in case you want to stay in touch. So Sasha, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Ariel. Thank you for another great session and for this full 2-day dive into LGBTQ preparedness. I want to leave space for folks to ask any questions in the last 12 minutes that we have, but thank you again for leading this excellent session, Ariel.
Yeah, thank you, Sasha, for having me, and thank you all of you. Like I said, if folks want to hang around and ask questions, you're welcome to. If you prefer to just contact me directly, you can also do that. And once you've gotten that evaluation up, you're welcome to exit the training. So you don't have to stay in the training in order to complete that evaluation. I trust that you'll get it done. I'll be sending that link when I send out the follow-up email, just in case you forgot. And yes, Gwen, you will be getting those handouts sent to your emails. Recording of this, that I will defer to Sasha as to how folks are going to be getting a recording of this.
Housing Solutions will post that on their website with all of the other recorded trainings. So as soon as that's posted, I'll send out a message to everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Sasha, and great question, Gwen. So again, thank you all for joining me. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I hope you have an excellent start to your weekend, and I look forward to staying in touch with all of you.
Thanks, Ariel.